Welcome to Her Remarkable History. Remember, to support our channel, please subscribe. The Erasing of Anne Boleyn. Now, Henry VIII is most known today, a tyrannical king who executed even 2 of his own wives. The downfall of Anne Boleyn is one which still today captivates the world, with the once Queen of England meeting her end at the executioner's block inside the Tower of London. On Tower Green, a small memorial stands on the site where the scaffold was created, where Anne and 2 other queens, along with a few others, were executed. To be executed inside the tower walls, in some degree of privacy, was seen as a privilege, only obtainable by special permission from the king or queen. Anne's execution was one that shocked a nation. During her short marriage to the king, she had divided a nation. Henry had split from the Catholic Church, beginning the English Reformation, causing decades of religious turmoil, and after the king's initial obsession and desire to marry Anne, it was seen as shocking when she was arrested. Henry's love life was tumultuous, and Anne's execution caused shockwaves across the country, with the Queen being beheaded. But how did Henry deal with this in the aftermath of the bloodshed on Tower Green? Some people today, when they end a relationship, and it ends in a bitter manner, may throw out their partner's possessions, and the more bitter people may have had a bonfire burning the possessions of their former lover. But what happened to Anne Boleyn's legacy? What happened to Henry when he had his wife executed? Well, we know that the king was already smitten with his 3rd wife, Jane Seymour, and that she had already been moved into the royal apartments. But Henry went further, taking huge steps to erase Anne Boleyn from memory and from history in a sense. Similarly to burning the possessions of a partner, Henry went further to destroy the legacy and image of Anne Boleyn, and to remove his association to her. When Anne was placed on trial in a sham trial presided over by her own uncle, this occurred inside the Tower of London, and she was found guilty of treason, adultery, and even incest. One way in which Henry tried to erase this event was the fact that he ordered many of the court documents and records of her trial to be destroyed, if any were even kept at all. If they weren't, the thought of a kangaroo court, as in a court with little planning, shows how much of a farce Anne's trial was. Also, many of her letters, which she wrote over the years, have either been hidden or destroyed, and there are very few examples of personal correspondence sent from Anne Boleyn that survive today. Henry hoped that his marriage to Anne would be forgotten, and that history would accept her as an adulterous woman who cheated on the king with many men, plotting Henry's own downfall. However, this hasn't been the case, as today Anne is viewed as a victim of Henry's lust for other women and his wandering eye, and she's also seen as a vulnerable victim of Thomas Cromwell's scheming. Henry even went further, hiding portraits and paintings of Anne, and there was a purging of her image across the country. Henry ultimately failed to get rid of every image of Anne, as today we have a number of spectacular images of her mostly painted after, and still today some paintings are being uncovered and are being linked to her. At Hever Castle, for example, recently a new painting was displayed that was now attributed to have been Anne. After Henry had rid his court and palaces of the images of Anne and records of her, he went further as he began to attack many of the buildings and architectural structures that she had a hand in designing and making during her short time on the throne. This was a rather difficult and expensive thing to do, and at the time he began to tarnish anything that had the Boleyn seal on, and also Anne's crest. At the time, the majority of the country was illiterate, and the nobility used heraldry and emblems to display their status, identity and power. Through the use of heraldry, one could decipher the family's past and if they have any links to royalty or affluence. Those of lower status would have smaller badges, but heraldry was a huge symbol of wealth. Anne, being the queen, had a coat of arms that would be displayed on a number of buildings and places. So what Henry did was he began to tear down any symbol of Anne's coat of arms and also banned its display. One of Anne's most displayed badges and emblems was a white falcon. Following her coronation, the bird was crowned, and it held a sceptre in its claw standing on a tree stump that from it came red and white roses, a symbol which has great meaning in English history. The falcon itself alluded to the resoluteness and good decision-making, and the colour showed Anne's purity. Anne also used the leopard as an emblem, but after her downfall, Henry went further to rid the castles and palaces of these. The symbols were everywhere, carved into ceilings, placed into stained glass windows, stamped on book covers, and placed onto furniture and decorations, so for Henry to rid the world from these symbols was tough for him. Henry, however, went further than simply to tear down the emblems of Anne. He tried to replace them also with those of his new queen, Jane Seymour, his third wife, and the woman who would give him a son. Interestingly, at Dover Castle, Henry had ordered some new windows earlier to be installed into the fortification with emblems of Anne Boleyn. However, he then ordered these windows to be torn out and replaced with Jane's name and emblem, the phoenix. Then Anne's leopard emblem was also altered at many sites, carved with heads and tails to become a panther for Jane. But the problem with this is that there were so many of these emblems of Anne that many were missed, and today they can still be spotted in different places around England. Now, Hampton Court Palace was one of the grandest palaces in the whole of England, and it was one that became one of Henry VIII's favourite, with him spending a huge amount of money renovating it, and also spending a lot of time there. Cardinal Wolsey was placed in charge of expanding and building the elaborate palace. Henry continued to build and add a great hall, and also even a royal tennis court. Anne Boleyn, when she was queen, added on to the decor of the palace, and one part of Hampton Court that bears her name is a beautiful gatehouse. On the ceiling of the grand hall of the palace is one of those missed symbols. Following Anne's downfall, Henry ordered the royal builders to take every reference to his former wife from the Great Hall, and many of them were found on the ceiling and in difficult places to reach and get to. One of these can still be found inside of the Great Hall. Most of the intertwined initials of Anne and Henry were changed to Henry and James, but one still does survive that the builders missed. There are more examples of this found across England also. One thing that Henry could not change, though, is the various possessions and gifts that Anne had given to him throughout their courtship and marriage. Many of these were carved with Anne's initials and were priceless. He did succeed in managing to rid the world of many contemporary paintings of Anne, and one that does survive is a bust of her that was cast onto a commemorative medallion to celebrate her second pregnancy around the year 1534. This is one of the only images of Anne we have from the time of her life. It's interesting to consider, however, how Henry felt when he would have seen some of these possessions that bore Anne's initials or her image. Would he have looked back on this moment with her in a positive manner or not? It's most probably not, as after Anne's death he never spoke of her name ever again. However, he could never erase her from the canon of English history. She is seen as a captivating figure still today, but interestingly, there is a twist to this tale. Through his daughter Elizabeth, he must have fondly thought of Anne. You see, Anne was Elizabeth's mother, and Henry even gave Elizabeth special permission to wear her mother's initial in a muriel, and her wearing a necklace with a pendant displaying the letter A. This was probably a tribute to her mother's memory, but it's unclear why Henry allowed his daughter to wear this, or even why Henry allowed the painter to include this. So still today, there are remains of Henry's attempts to erase Anne Boleyn from his mind, memory, and subsequently from history. She is possibly the most famous of Henry's 6 wives, and from this we can see that he failed greatly to discredit Anne and rid her from history. Interestingly, the modern perception of Anne shows her as a victim of the tyrant king, and as a woman who met her death with strength, determination, and courage. What cannot be disputed is what happened on the 19th of May 1536 inside the walls of the Tower of London. A swordsman brought to England from France took her head off with such ferocity and skill that with one swift motion Anne Boleyn was no more. She was then laid to rest inside the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. Her remains were left unidentified under the floor of the chapel for over 300 years, until the chapel was renovated after Queen Victoria ordered the chapel to be a place fit for a royal burial. Today there is a small grave marker that displays her coat of arms and bears her name, but it is a very low-key burial. Henry's attempt to erase Anne from history were a complete failure, and today opinions have reverted as to who the real villain of the Boleyn debacle was, and time has shown the king to have been savage. He made no attempt to spare her life, simply being kind by bringing a swordsman to take her life, rather than to have Anne's head taken by the commoner's axe, for Henry was such a loving husband. Once again, thank you for watching, and to support our channel, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.